Well, welcome back this afternoon. I'm Professor Tim Demme in the College of Operational and Strategic Leadership here at the War College, and I hope you had a stimulating morning and a nice break during lunch. And this afternoon, we'd like to continue our conference with ideas on ethics and senior military leaders, and we'll be doing so with a case study and a discussion. Participating with us via VTC is Major General Gregg Martin, U.S. Army War College, and here in the auditorium, Dr. Martin Cook, Stockdale Professor of Professional Military Ethics at the War College. Major General Gregg Martin is the 48th Commandant of the United States Army War College. Prior to his arrival at Carlisle, Major General Martin served in Kuwait as Deputy Commanding General of 3rd Army and U.S. Army Central during the simultaneous buildup in Afghanistan and drawdown from Iraq. Before that, he served as Commanding General of the U.S. Army Maneuver Support Center of Excellence in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Born in Massachusetts, Major General Martin graduated from the U.S. Military Academy with a bachelor's degree and was commissioned into the Army Corps of Engineers. He subsequently earned master's degrees in civil engineering and technology policy, as well as a PhD in engineering management and public policy from MIT, with a dissertation on strategic leadership and organizational change. He is a graduate of the Naval War College and the Army War College and holds master's degrees in strategic studies from both institutions. Critical command and troop leadership positions include Commandant of the U.S. Army Engineer School and Regiment and Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Army Maneuver Support Center in Fort Leonard Wood, Commanding General and Division Engineer of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Northwestern Division in Portland, Oregon, and command of the 130th Engineer Brigade and service as 5th Corps CJTF-7 Engineer in Europe and the Middle East from June 2002 to July 2004, which included the ground assault to Baghdad, liberation of Iraq, and leading an expanded brigade of 13,000 soldiers conducting full-spectrum operations across Iraq in the first year of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Major General Martin's staff positions include Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff, Operations and Plans for U.S. Army Europe and 7th Army in Heidelberg, Germany. He also served as instructor and director of senior command and leadership at the Army War College, instructor and assistant professor of national security studies, international relations and American politics in the Department of Social Sciences, as well as recruiting and admissions officer at the U.S. Military Academy. Major General Martin's awards and decorations include the Legion of Merit, 3 awards, the Bronze Star Medal, Meritorious Service Medal, 8 awards, and Joint Service Commendation Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, 2 awards, Army Achievement Medal, Parachutist Badge, Ranger Tab, and Combat Action Ribbon. Major General Martin has recently been selected to be the new president of National Defense University. In discussion with Major General Martin is his former professor, Dr. Martin Cook, who was with us this morning. Dr. Cook is the Admiral James Bond Stockdale Professor of Professional Military Ethics at the Naval War College. Dr. Cook received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He has previously served as Professor of Philosophy and Deputy Department Head, Department of Philosophy at the United States Air Force Academy, Professor of Ethics and Elihu Root Chair of Military Studies at the United States Army War College, and as a tenured member of the faculty at Santa Clara University, California. He has also taught at St. Xavier University, Gustavus Adolphus College, the College of William and Mary, the Graduate Institute of St. John's College in New Mexico. Dr. Cook serves as an editor of the Journal of Military Ethics and as a member of the editorial board of Parameters, the scholarly journal of the U.S. Army War College. He is the author of 2 books, co-author of a 3rd, and more than 35 scholarly articles. He has lectured on topics of military ethics in the United Kingdom, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Norway. His most recent book, The Moral Warrior, Ethics and Service in the U.S. Military, was published in 2003 and is now undergoing revision for a 2nd edition. General Martin and Dr. Cook.
All right, let me explain a little of the origins of this session. This morning was pretty high strategic level stuff. And so we thought we'd like to have a couple of sessions that are a little closer to where you all are in your command course or where you will be soon. And so that's the point of this afternoon session. The idea for what we're going to do this afternoon actually began here in Newport at the Major Command Course, which meets at the other end of the base, which is everybody in the Navy taking their first major command, multi-ship command and things like that. And it arose out of sessions that we started doing over there 3 years ago, and it occurred to us that the best way to do this lesson was to integrate some ethics reflection with a case study drawn from the commander's own major command tour. That was originally Captain Bill Nault, who is in the senior class here now and continues now with Captain Slotsky over there. So we use a different case in each case based on what their own actual command experience. This particular talk today began when I went down to Carlisle for the distance education summer course. And I asked General Martin whether he would be interested in doing this collaboratively as well with a land power example. So this is a land power example based on his brigade command. And I think it's a very good illustration of a number of points that we want to make and get you to think about the nature of leadership challenges at levels only 1 or 2 grades above where you are. So that's the point of the story. So let me start with just a few general reflections. I think there are some specific challenges to really understanding ethics in any deep way. And it's not your fault. It's sort of things the culture has done to you. But let me run through a couple of them. First of all, when you say ethics, to a lot of people in the military, they think law. They think it's all about the lawyers and it's a matter of the JAGs. And we've, to some degree, done this for you because we get an annual ethics brief, which is, of course, the talk about the Ethics in Government Act, and it's stuff that will send you to jail. So there's an association in your mind between ethics and law. So as we go through the case that we're going to talk about today, one of the things I want you to note is there's absolutely nothing in this case for which a lawyer would have been helpful. Absolutely nothing in this case. Secondly, a lot of so-called ethics failures really aren't. They're just straightforward violations of the law. So they get written up in the press as failures of ethics, but they're not. They're things that people either knew or should have known were legal or illegal, and they went ahead and did them anyway. Those are, frankly, philosophically not interesting. They're important, but they're not interesting. Another problem is the way military organizations tend to think they're going to solve ethics problems. This was first pointed out to me by another friend of General Martin's and mine, George Reed, who's a retired Army colonel, teaches in the leadership school at San Diego. He said, you know, when military organizations fail, they think of 3 possible solutions, or usually all of them all at once. You fire the leadership, you mandate some more training, and you issue some more policies. And cumulatively, that's supposed to fix your problem, right? But one of the things to think about is, what if none of those things work? And by the way, if you keep doing that repetitively, you'll end up with the kind of hidebound bureaucracy that Dr. Snyder was talking about earlier today. You'll have so many regulations you can't move. So there are some fallacies in trying to approach every problem that way. But another reason to worry about that is, what if your problem is none of those things? What if it's a systemic problem? And the simplest example that I know, because it happened when General Martin and I were both at Carlisle, is when General Shinseki came in as Chief of Staff of the Army. One of the very first things he did was call up and say, I want you to give me 10 colonels to study what's wrong with the Army readiness reporting system. Because I know for a fact that I don't know how ready the Army is. Why not? Because the culture of the Army is such that it's impossible to report below C2. No company commander could do it, and if he or she tried, they'd be counseled and it would be pencil whipped and it would come back, it would become back higher anyway. So ask yourself, if a company commander or a captain in the Army falsely writes down that his unit is, say, C2 or C1 when it's not, is he lying? Is she lying? Well, in the ordinary sense of the word, yeah, right? I mean, they're stating an intentional and known falsehood. But it would also be a completely dim-witted way to think about the problem, right? Because what's driving the behavior is not a question of personal integrity or of ethics. It's a response to a system that no company commander can fix. It's back to what Dr. Snyder was talking about today about the stewards of the profession. Until somebody with enough stars on their shoulder changes that system, then it's not going to be possible, right? So one thing to think about as you rise in rank is you start owning pieces of the system, right? And as you own more and more pieces of the system, you may have available to you fixes that you don't have available to you at lower ranks. And so that's one of the developmental challenges I think we have for you as you rise. So what we're going to suggest, and I think what General Martin's case will show you, is that some of the situations that arise are just inherently ambiguous. Military people train for certainty. That's largely functional for you, that we want you to struggle against Murphy's Law and anticipate everything that can go wrong. That's all fine. But if you find yourself in a situation that is inherently complex and you insist on approaching it in a linear fashion, you're very likely to think yourself in a nice, neat, linear fashion into total mission failure because you don't appreciate the complexities of what's before you. So I think his case will illustrate that for you. Now, at Carlisle, they've invented an acronym. Everybody has acronyms, but I like this one. VUCA. Sometimes we jokingly call Carlisle VUCA-U. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Let me just talk about each of the words briefly. Volatile. Term borrowed from chemistry, right? It's something that evaporates quickly. But I think what it means in the context is the chances that you as a senior leader are going to be doing today what you thought you were going to be doing when you came in is very low. It's going to be something else, something you didn't anticipate, something you hadn't been planned to be doing today. And so if you're not comfortable with that, then you're just not going to be successful. It's uncertain. It's not that you just haven't worked hard enough to get it certain. It's inherently uncertain. You really can't know when you make your decision what the right thing to do is. It's inherently very complex, and it's ambiguous, meaning that even when you're done, you're not sure you got all the information right, you're not sure you fully understood the situation, you're not sure you made the right decision. So we're going to suggest to you today that ethics gets pretty VUCA too at more senior levels. And that's an uncomfortable thought in my experience for a lot of military officers because military people tend to have a pretty limited moral vocabulary, basically two words, integrity and professional, right? And talk as if you maintained your integrity and you were professional, then that would solve all problems. But of course, the word professional is being used in a way very different than Don Snyder's way of using it with precision. It's being used as a sort of all-purpose term of praise and disapprobation, right? So everything from a messy desk to mission failure is unprofessional, right? And integrity would suggest that if you are just, as a person, consistent in your behavior, then it'll all be clear for you. But if you're in an ambiguous or VUCA environment, personal integrity is not going to do it for you. It's going to be more complicated than that. So I'm going to suggest a definition of ethics that's probably novel to you, but I'm going to distinguish between ethics and morals. I'm going to define ethics as critical reflection on moral beliefs, moral judgments, and moral actions. The reason that's important is as we go through life as adults, we're confronted with moral situations all the time, and we make decisions rather intuitively. We have what I'd like to call a moral gut. It just sort of feels right to you, feels wrong to you. And we all know where that came from. It's a complicated story for each of us as individuals, upbringing, family, community, religious community, if you're from one, all of those things play. But as the world gets more complicated, all of us get to points where we have to say, this is what my morals have always been, this is what my moral beliefs have always been. But I wonder whether they're right. I'm now running into people who disagree with me or see it differently, or I don't immediately see how my moral gut resolves the complicated problem before me. And when you get to that level, you've got to stop and do some critical reflection. What do I really, no kidding, think here? So the reasons that you need to do it are these. If you have these moral intuitions, they were formed in largely non-rational ways, right? We didn't sit down and just think about this. You got it out of the air you breathe as you grew up. Furthermore, as you come into new and more complicated environments, for example, for most of us, when you went to college, you were suddenly around people from very different places than where you came from. If you went to graduate school or into the military, that increasing diversity continues. As you deploy around the world, you run into other cultures. You realize other people really do fundamentally see the world differently. All of that requires you to do some critical thinking about where am I in that mix, right? And it's possible that you just happen to be the guy lucky enough to be born in the place where you got it right and everybody else is wrong. But the probability that that's true is pretty low. So if that's true, you're gonna have to think about it. One reason VUCA gets worse as you get more senior is you get a more complicated web of obligations. And you have to think over longer time frames. If you are, for example, in the Navy, the commander of a ship, your moral world is pretty simple. You're in charge of your ship. and you're answerable to your immediate superiors, and you operate that ship. As soon as you move, for example, in the Major Command Course to a multi-ship command that gets dispersed all over an area of operations, suddenly you don't even have visibility on your command, right? You don't see all the pieces, you don't know what they're doing on any given day with any fidelity. You're not focusing on some things that they're doing that you don't know about that might come back to bite you. All kinds of things are involved. So if you think about, for example, the CNO, to go to the end of the scale, what's CNO got to think about? CNO's got to think about the health of the Navy today. They've got to think about the health of the Navy 10 and 20 years from now. They've got to think about their relationship to the current administration, but also far beyond that, because the current administration's time frame is the election cycle, right? And they've got to think about relations to other navies, and they've got to think at the deepest level about the trust and confidence of the American people that Don was talking about today. I can play the old guy card. I went to college in 1969, and if you remember your ancient history, you remember my freshman year was the Cambodian invasion and Kent State, and the National Guard was bivouacked on the quad of my campus for all of spring semester because it was nearly impossible to go to class for all the bomb threats, right? So it wasn't safe to wear an ROTC uniform across our campus in those years. So if you want to see what it looks like when the American people lose confidence in you, it's ugly, and I've seen it. And don't think it can't happen, because it can indeed happen. Okay, so with that as a background, General Martin is going to walk us through this very interesting case from his own brigade command experience. So over to you, sir.
Okay, thanks, Martin. And great to be with you all, although sorry it's by VTC. I would love to be there in person, but that just wasn't meant to be. Hey, first off, congratulations to everybody in the audience. Thanks for your great service. I was really fortunate, had a year in Newport, 91, 92. I went to the Naval College of Command and Staff, but what an awesome place. It was absolutely great. In fact, I was with your president yesterday, Admiral Christensen, down in DC at a meeting, and I'm really happy that Don Snyder was with you this morning, and hopefully Don's there as well to continue the dialogue in the military profession. Because a lot of this material, that's what it's really all about, is this idea of profession and stewardship. Martin Cook, who is a colleague of mine from when we taught here at the War College, he asked me to present this case. But I got to tell you, I have a lot of other cases that are, in fact, much more complicated, much more ambiguous, much more in the gray zone that I've experienced since I've moved on from the time of this particular case study. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and get into it and tell you a little bit about my experience as the commander of the 130th Engineer Brigade. So how did I get to, this is the 06 level command. I had been a student at the Army War College, graduated in 2000, was supposed to go into command the next summer, and they kept me here on faculty where I got to teach with Martin. And then the next year I had unfortunately, we had a huge health crisis. One of my kids got really sick, and I made the really, really tough decision to defer command for a year, which that is a whole nother case study we could talk about sometime. So anyway, I got slated to go command the 130th Engineers, part of 5th U.S. Corps in Germany. Great command, and I went into it in June of 2002. Showed up on the ground in Germany, and we had elements of the brigade. I had 3 active duty battalions at the time in Germany, and I had about close to a battalion's worth in Kosovo. In fact, my first month on the job, I had 2 guys blown up in an attack, and I went down. Actually, we pinned on Purple Hearts on those guys. I had another battalion in Bulgaria doing a Partnership for Peace mission, which was another whole very interesting part of the world, and we experienced some amazing things working with the Bulgarians as they were on their journey for inclusion into NATO. And then I had folks deployed to other parts of the European Command AOR. Big things on the screen when I showed up in the summer of 2002. We had a exercise, Partnership for Peace exercise, for the deployment to the Czech Republic in the fall of 2002. That was a top strategic priority for the government of the United States, for the NATO commander, and for our 4-star commander, the U.S. Army Europe Theater commander. This was a huge deal where the entire 130th Engineer Brigade was going to deploy to the Czech Republic, do a whole bunch of exercises, training, construction, et cetera, as a way to really build that relationship with the Czech Republic. So this was a big deal going on, that was on the, we were planning for that, we were funded for it, the anticipation was we were going to go and do this thing for a couple months, pretty much end of October through December, about a 2-month exercise. And everybody was really looking forward to it. At the same time, we had a top secret mission that had been bubbling for some time for a possible ground assault into Iraq, timing unclear. And this was, top secret, compartmentalized information. We all had to sign statements that we wouldn't discuss it with anybody except those who were authorized. And so obviously, in the back of our mind, or not really even the back, we're thinking, okay, we could be going to war in Iraq, deploying to Kuwait. And oh, by the way, 5th Corps, my higher headquarters, commanded by then Lieutenant General William Wallace, we were the designated main effort for the ground assault to Baghdad. So in terms of the CFLIC, the Coalition Ground Component Command, 5th Corps was the main effort. And we can talk about that at the end, but basically we would be the main effort. Supporting effort would be the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. Also, some of the context, the brigade, the 130th, the 5th Corps Engineer Brigade, we had been running nonstop for more than a decade. Literally had not had a break in the action since the first Gulf War, coming home from that in 1991. They had been in, Kurdistan in the northern part. They had done all the Balkan deployments, et cetera, et cetera. So things were just, this brigade had been run very, very hard, put away wet for many, many years. So that's some background. So when I took command in June of '02, had to get out, circulate around the battlefield, see the unit, get to know everybody, figure out what was going on. I was struck by the poor condition of the maintenance of our heavy equipment. And when you talk about ground combat, all that heavy equipment, stuff like bulldozers and bucket loaders and armored personnel carriers and mine clearance equipment and stuff that you're going to clear minefields and knock down berms and stuff like that and put assault float bridges in, all that big heavy stuff. You need that to generate the combat power and the mobility to actually enable ground forces to move over the earth, overcome the laws of physics, and get to the objective. And most of that equipment is pretty low density. It requires a lot of maintenance, a lot of proper supply discipline, and so forth. It was in poor condition. The second point is that the families and the soldiers were stressed. Folks were spread out all over the place. My units had done multiple deployments to Bosnia, Kosovo, et cetera, and there was a lot of wear and tear on the families. And this was in the summer of '02. My team was of mixed opinion. The folks on my staff about the readiness, the state of whether this Czech exercise made sense, whether we ought to really consider maybe this isn't such a good idea if in fact we're going to go deploy to Kuwait and attack to Baghdad. I had a wide-ranging opinion that, hey, a lot of the folks were really can-do. Hey, sir, we can do this. The Czech exercise will be awesome. No worries. We can do it. We can make it all happen. So I had a lot of different opinions. Again, the Czech Republic mission, and it's worth reiterating, this was a huge strategic priority up from 4-star and above. And I put it in parenthesis, I don't want to dwell on it, but I actually had a little bit of history with, as you do by the time you make 06 command, and it was kind of uneasy. I won't go into it, but I did not have a real solid relationship with the 4-star commander. Luckily, I had a couple guys in between, but that was also part of the context. So there we are, and we've got this deployment that we're supposed to move out on in about a month. And then we're looking and planning hard for the potential deployment to Kuwait, ground assault, invasion, liberation of Iraq. Okay, so what are my obligations? I'm thinking, man, I am entrusted to take care of these soldiers and their families. I also have to take care of these subordinate units and do the thing that is best for them, as well as their staffs. I'm also a subordinate element of 5th Corps, my higher headquarters. And so the Corps, a lot of their reputation is riding on our unit had for a couple of years been the one planned to do this Czech deployment, Partnership for Peace, our big contribution to NATO to the strategic level. But on the other hand, if we go and have to fight a ground war, the Corps is absolutely relying on me and my brigade to provide the mobility and the punch to get to Baghdad. Thinking ahead, I've also got all the supported units that my brigade and my units, and that I, as the 5th Corps engineer and brigade commander, I mean, I am going to be meeting face to face and having to look these guys in the eye to support with extra engineer support, 3rd Infantry Division, who was our main effort within 5th Corps, 1st Armored Division, 101st Airborne, 82nd Airborne Division, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. I mean, I have an obligation to those guys and their units that I'm going to do everything I can, should we go to war, to help them get to the objective. I've also got an obligation as part of U.S. Army Europe and part of NATO. I've got an obligation to them. And their number one mission at the time was clearly this Czech Republic. I'm also thinking, holy cow, man, I am a steward of the engineer profession within the profession of arms and the credibility of Army engineers, because if we flop and, when we go up to, breach the berm and the bulldozers break down and we can't get through, or when we come to the Euphrates River under fire and we have to do an assault river crossing, and oh, by the way, the boats and the bridges and the stuff doesn't work and the river crossing fails, holy Toledo. I mean, that would be horrible, and it would be me as the failing senior engineer when the point of application to do fundamentally what we're paid to do for the country. We've also got an obligation to the nation, win the nation's wars, and this is looming. So I've got the long-term success in this possible war that we don't know if it's going to go, versus short-term, and we would have gone to the Czech Republic, and I'm sure we would have knocked it out of the park, hit a home run, would have been a great success, would have made a lot of high-level people very, very happy, and we would have done important things. So those were a few of the obligations that I was looking at. So I did my assessment, and at the end of it, I wasn't quite sure. But my instincts, and by the way, I was actually, when I made the final decision, we were doing a big train up in Poland at a huge training area in Poland, where we were able to move our artillery and our aviation assets from 5th Corps and do the final tune-ups and ranges and do deep fires and stuff as a final tune-up for a potential ground war. So I'm actually in this Polish training area, and I did all my assessments. I'm calling guys on the phone, doing my analysis and everything. Finally, I just said, okay, I have got to make this decision, and I made the decision that I needed to go forward and say my recommendation and request is to pull plug and cancel the Czech deployment in order to create the time, the space, free up the energy, particularly in terms of time, to do a very, very focused, deliberate maintenance stand down on all of our equipment. So I made the decision. So I worked for a 2-star who was the deputy corps commander, awesome guy, Walt Wojciechowski. So I went in and said, sir, I got to talk to you. And I bypassed the staff and everything. I just totally pulled out the green tab commander's card, because I was also the 5th Corps staff engineer. And so the chief of staff and the Corps G3 were very, very unhappy, but that was okay. I went straight to General Wojciechowski, said, hey, sir, I need to talk to you about this upcoming exercise. I said, sir, bottom line up front, we need to pull plug on Czech and do the requisite preparation for the potential ground war. And he just said, Gregg, you're killing me. Are you aware that the Czech deployment is the #1 mission for the Corps, the U.S. Army Europe, and the NATO commander? I said, yes, sir, I'm very much aware of that. And so he said, tell me why. So I walked him through everything, and he pushed, he really, as he should have, argued with me on everything to try to make sure I was solid, to test, do I really have my act together? Do I really know what I'm talking about? At the end of the day, we went through this briefing, and he said, Gregg, okay, take 24 hours, think about it, sleep on it, and come back and see me tomorrow. And make sure that's still what you recommend and what you want to do. I said, okay, Roger. So I went back, thought about it, and I did think about it again. And I called the team again, and I went back through everything just to make sure I was on solid ground. So anyway, bottom line, next day I said, sir, went back and saw General Wojciechowski, the 2-star, said, sir, we need to do this. He said, okay, I'll support you. So off we went to go see the Corps commander, 3-star Lieutenant General William Wallace. And that really was his name, William Wallace, Braveheart, cavalryman, awesome commander. So I give him the bottom line. He said, oh, Gregg, you're killing me, man. You got to be kidding. How can you do that? This is our #1 mission. So I talked him through it, and he said, Gregg, Take 24 hours. Think about it. Sleep on it. Make sure this is really what you want to do and come back and see me tomorrow. So he did. Anyway, went back and saw him, said, sir, this is what we need to do. And I said, okay, I'll take you up to see the U.S. Army Europe commander, who actually had flown out to the Polish training area. He was actually on site there in Poland. So I went and saw him and reported to him. And it was kind of like, oh, you got to be kidding me. How can you do this? This is a super high priority mission, et cetera, et cetera. Talked him through it. And he listened really well. And he said, are you telling me that if we drive on with the Czech mission, you will fail if we go to war in Iraq? And I basically thought about it. And I said, sir, I'm telling you that the risk will be unacceptably high and that there is a high probability, high risk, if we don't do the proper maintenance and get this key equipment ready, there's a very good likelihood that we will fail. That the stuff will actually break down, this engineer equipment, it's old, it's beat up, it's been run hard, that as we're moving over the battlefield through the deserts of Iraq, under fire, there's a good chance this stuff will break. And, the maneuver units will not be able to get to the objective and do the river crossings, et cetera. He said, okay, if that's your assessment, I will back you up. So we talked about that. So at the end of the day, everybody supported it. So what we did, and this was early October, we canceled the exercise, and, the USAR commander and NATO did some diplomacy, and it was not a happy time. And my Corps Chief of Staff and the three came back and they kind of tackled me and said, man, what are you doing? And they basically were looking, hey, is there something we can do, a lesser scaled exercise, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, though, we canceled it entirely, and some people did the diplomatic, smoothing over the feathers. And the thing that was tricky about it was we couldn't tell the Czechs and we couldn't tell our NATO partners what we were doing and why, because it was top secret. We couldn't tell them that the reason we're doing it is, oh, by the way, we think we're going to go invade Iraq, because it was top secret. So it was a very dicey kind of political thing that they had to work through. But at the end of the day, we canceled the exercise. We conducted a very comprehensive maintenance and supply stand down in lieu of the Czech Republic deployment. I took the entire brigade budget in the first quarter of what was then FY03. We spent the whole thing on tools, on maintenance. We pulled every piece of equipment. We TI'd it. We were at the end of that quarter. We spent every penny we had. We were in the best shape in terms of supply and maintenance and the equipment that we had probably ever been in, which was a really good news story. And the entire budget was gone in the first quarter. So that was kind of an interesting bet. Equipment was in great shape if we had to go fight. If we didn't, we had no money left for the rest of the fiscal year. And what I told everybody in the brigade, I said, hey, if we don't go to war, the equipment will be in great shape, and we are going to do a lot of PT, a lot of sports. We'll do some good staff rides. We'll do a lot of dismounted infantry and sapper training, and it would have been good. But so that's where we were. The reflection on this. I've got a bunch of things I could share with you. But here we'll kind of go down the line. First, you as a commander, as a leader, you have got to get out and see for yourself. You can't sit in your office and read the reports and have the staff feed you. You got to get out and go see, do your battlefield circulation, do your assessment. Then, because I would have had a different picture if I hadn't gotten out and really seen this stuff. Then you got to leverage and rely on your experience, your instincts, your expertise, and that of your expert staff members. I was really fortunate. I had a CW5 who was my chief maintenance warrant officer, who I had a relationship with. He was actually my company maintenance tech when I was a 03. He was my battalion when I was a battalion XO, and then he was my brigade maintenance tech as an 06. We really had tremendous trust and confidence, and he could tell me stuff that other people would not be as candid. And so I relied heavily on him, and he was a true expert. I will tell you that this didn't occur to me until much later. And probably as I started reviewing this case study in conjunction with Martin, I have to ask myself now, was I too black and white? Could I or should I have been more flexible? Couldn't I have developed a compromise option? Because I had one battalion who perhaps could have gone and done the Czech Republic exercise, and they were really gung-ho. They wanted to do it. They had a different situation with their equipment. They had a different set of circumstances. I had another battalion that absolutely needed the stand down. You know, maybe I was too black and white. Maybe I was too immature in my thinking and my assessment, and maybe I should have come up with a middle ground and given my 2, 3, and 4-star bosses a way out of this dilemma so that I didn't have to put my 4-star in a situation where he had to go and say, hey, sorry, we can't do this. You know, maybe I was immature then as an 06, and that's something that has come into my mind lately as I've reflected on sort of my thinking back, which was then back in 2002. I do think, in retrospect, and again, this is the other side of that, I believe it was the right decision. And I really believed it in the aftermath of it and when we got the DEP board. And of course, this decision was made in early October of 2002. About 2 or 3 days before Christmas in 02, we got the deployment order, 5th Corps deployed to Kuwait, prepare to do this mission, 1003 Victor. And we were actually, it was our brigade and battalions inside the brigade. We were actually the first guys to deploy out of Germany into Kuwait. We were some of the first units on the ground in Kuwait. And I'll never forget this. We were in Vilseck, Germany. We were doing our final warfighter exercise and the Grafenwehr training exercise. And we had in the commanders and staff from 3rd Infantry, 82nd Airborne, 101st, 5th Corps, all these different outfits. And the 94th Engineer Battalion, huge, big engineer unit in Vilseck, their motor pool is just huge. 2nd Cav Regiment's there now. I mean, literally, when that motor pool is full, there's equipment as far as you can see. And there we were. The equipment had all moved out on rail. It was loading onto ships en route down to Kuwait. And we did the deployment ceremony. You know, the families were there, the flags, the troops, the buses were lined up. And we did our deployment ceremony. It was Lieutenant General Wallace, the Corps Commander, Sergeant Major Preston, who was the 5th Corps Sergeant Major, General Wojciechowski. And it was an unbelievable scene. It was pitch black at night, freezing cold, snowing. And when the troops marched off and we did we cased the colors and we put them on buses, General Wallace, Victory 6 was his call sign. He said, well, Sapper, and that was my call sign, Sapper. He said, well, Sapper, I guess you made the right call with regard to the Czech exercise. And it was like, oh, wow, okay. So that was pretty interesting. That kind of validation that we had made the right move, because that particular battalion was the one that most needed the maintenance work. And then when we were on Baghdad Airport, early April 2003, basically on the airfield, we had, fought, and 3rd ID was the main effort and everything. And there we were on the Saddam International Airport before we renamed it to the Baghdad International Airport, April 2003, on the airfield with Corps Commander General Wallace. Engineers had just really performed unbelievably in combat. And right there he said, he basically put his arm around my shoulder and said, hey, Sapper, you definitely made the right call back in Poland when we made that call to pull plug on Czech. So that was pretty good validation. But I think what you have to do is when you look at these situations, and again, this is, in retrospect, over the last 10 years and the stuff I've dealt with as a flag officer, this is really relatively simple and straightforward. But in all of these complicated cases, you really got to assess the risks and the rewards. And they go into different domains, but you got to really do a ruthless, honest, objective, and subjective assessment of the risks and rewards of the various courses of action. And then I think we really have an obligation, and this is easy to say, and I think I did a pretty good job in this case, but as you move up, speaking the truth to power and helping to lead up and inform, it becomes tougher. It becomes grayer because the situation is not as closely tied to life and death as this. Soldiers on the battlefield, a real combat mission. A lot of times, you're miles and miles removed in headquarters, multiple headquarters layers removed from the point of the spear. And a lot of times, the situation is not as clear as the one I've laid out. But you've got to think your way through this and really think hard about, standing up and being morally courageous and speaking truth to power. Okay, and I in no way am saying that as a way that, oh gee, look at me, because I think we're all human, but it's something you got to reflect on, and your thinking becomes more complex, and sometimes you need to pierce through the fog of that complexity and the VUCA that Martin described, and really get back down to the basics of what this is all about, and just speak that clear, candid truth and help lead up. So, a couple other things on reflection. It is very important to, and this goes back to what Don Snyder talked about, rely on your professional expert knowledge to make your decisions. Don't ever feel bound or stuck, feel like you have to stick to a schedule or stick to a process or to a timeline or to some bureaucratic mindset. I mean, as the senior leaders in the profession, which all of you are, man, we got to make the call. And sometimes it means upsetting the apple cart and doing unpopular things and really making people mad at you. And I really made a lot of people very, very upset and mad at me with regard to this Czech cancellation. The second point is, it's very interesting. You don't get promoted to be where you are or to get where I got to be. A brigade commander of a combat engineer brigade. I mean, that was like awesome, way above anything I ever thought. You don't get there by telling people the best course of action is to not do something. Okay, you get promoted in the military by being can-do, finding a way to do it, overcoming obstacles, figuring out, man, I can make this happen. Oh, give me that, I can make that happen too. And oh, by the way, yeah, and we'll be balanced, and we're going to do it all, and we're going to take care of troops, and we're going to have fun, and we're going to make it all happen. Sometimes what the senior leader needs to do is say, you know what? This thing is more important than all the others. And so the big thing to me, in my mind, was clearly, and we didn't know if we were going to go to Kuwait and Iraq, but that looming on the horizon, the possibility, that was the one big thing. And everything else, in my mind, I had to push back, smush it down in importance and focus on that big thing relentlessly. And to do that, to set that priority, the real key to that is, what am I not going to do? And as strategically important as that Czech exercise was, that was not as important as what we might have to do. And so, ironically, the paradox was probably the most important thing I did for my brigade and my troops in combat, helping 5th Corps succeed, helping 3rd ID get to Baghdad, was to come up on the net and say not to do something versus everything in my instinct, in most of my subordinates are saying, man, we can do this. Let's go do it. So that's a paradox. I think the bottom bullet there is you got to prioritize and focus on what's most important. And here, if we come back to it in the Q&A, I have a little metaphor here, the walnuts and the rice. But what's the important thing and what's less important? The walnuts being most important, the rice being less. And then finally, I just want to close with an article that I know you all have read. I have read this twice now. What a magnificent article, The Bathsheba Syndrome, The Ethical Failure of Successful Leaders. Man, put this in your toolbox. Put this in your kit bag. There is an amazing amount of wisdom and truth in this article. I think it is, I agree with the thesis. It is amazing. This strikes me more than any other thing I've ever read about why people at senior levels go so wrong. So I commend this to you, and I do agree that ethical challenges are much more complex, and they tend to take on a different quality the more senior you get. And as you rise in rank and position, and your responsibilities increase, and your world tends to evolve at that strategic level, things get much more complicated. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Martin. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, sir. I went in fairly briefly just with a few thoughts about how you might think about ethical complexity. This was going to remind you all and give you flashbacks of college physics. I apologize. But I think this is actually a fairly useful metaphor to think about how to think about complicated ethics problems. Most of you probably did vector analysis or engineering mechanics at some point along the way. You're the dot in the middle, right? You remember when you start doing vector analysis problems, there are two basic kinds of mistakes you can make. You fail to identify a vector, or you get the magnitude of one of the vectors wrong. Those are the ways that you mess it up, right? So if you think of yourself as the dot in the middle, and you think about this web of obligations I was talking about as things pulling on you, pulling in different directions, they don't all line up with each other. When they all line up with each other, life is simple. Of course, the weakness of the analogy is in physics, the magnitude of the vector can be determined with mathematical precision. In ethics, it can't. So how do we, as a practical matter, try to determine the magnitude, or even in some cases the directionality of all the vectors, or to make sure that we don't miss vectors? Well, I think it requires a kind of meta skill. You need to think about how do you, in fact, think through a complicated ethics problem when you run into one. Just one example from my own life. In Myers-Briggs terms, I'm an INTJ. There are prayers from Myers-Briggs types on the internet. Mine is, Lord, keep me open to the ideas of others, wrong though they are. One of my best friends, a guy I first met in 1982, my friend Jim, is exactly opposite of me on all four dimensions. That means when I first met him, I literally couldn't understand him. I mean, I understand the world he lives in, I understand how he thinks. But as we became better and better friends, I came to realize that there's no complicated problem in my life that won't benefit from talking it over with Jim, because he's going to see stuff I never saw. And so I guess one tip I would suggest to you is try to figure out who plays the role of Jim in your life, who can help you do stuff like that. And as you rise in command, it gets lonelier. I mean, one of the things that comes up in these major command course examples is often there were, in fact, people that the commander, the major commander, could have reached out to for help, but they hardly ever thought about it, or hardly ever thought to do it. So one meta skill here, too, would be that. And as General Martin talks about his case, clearly he did a lot of consulting with a lot of people. He still had to, in the end, make an ambiguous, complex, and uncertain decision. But he didn't do it in isolation, and that is, I think, a factor to think about. So if you think about ethical decision-making as vector analysis, then you can kind of think of it as a stepwise process. Again, I don't want to suggest this is an algorithm. This isn't, you can't put stuff in the grinder, turn the crank, and get the right answer. Everybody understands that. But you can kind of think about it as a stepwise process. What are the relevant obligations here? What are the relevant principles that I want to be concerned about? So in respect that this course of action might not be entirely truthful, that's a wrong-making feature of the action. In the respect that it achieves a highly desirable outcome, that's a right-making feature of the action, right? These are vectors in play. We already talked about trying to assign them directionality and magnitude. And then think about making an actual decision as the sum of the vectors. I mean, as you listen to General Martin talk, clearly he was summing an awful lot of vectors to get to the conclusion he did. And one of the things that proves the complexity and uncertainty of the environment is now as he looks back at it, he wonders, was I too black and white in my thinking about it? Maybe there were gray or in-between options I could have considered that didn't occur to me at the time. Now, one last thing I want to mention is a lot's going on in the Navy about this right now. The CNO sent terms of reference to the War College just in January, saying, I want you guys to help us figure out how better to institutionalize the Navy ethos. Part of this is being driven by the excessive number of firings for cause, but far more importantly is the sense that have we got as much attention to the Navy ethos and how to develop our officers in the kind of complex ways that we've been talking about, and could we do a better job? So this is the actual language of the tasker. This is the task to us, and we are in the process of trying to figure out how to do that. Clearly, historically, the Navy hasn't paid a lot of attention explicitly to how to develop officers, so we're working on that. Here's another task from VCNO to look at a leadership and training continuum from E1 to at least 06 or 07, it focuses on the attributes, behaviors, and ethos of the naval profession. And to the conversation we were having with Dr. Snyder this morning, try to think about whether a one-size-fits-all fit rep is really what you want. Do you want to look for different attributes, different skills for mid-grade officers, for senior officers? Can you rework the entire officer evaluation and promotion system so that it reflects attention to that? All of these questions are explicitly on the table for the Navy now. And then I want to end with this quote from the current Joint Forces Quarterly. And you remember General Dempsey was the impetus for this intense focus on these questions in the Army. I suspect that's another reason that CNO is asking us about this is, I imagine he's asking the other chiefs of the other services, in the tank, what are you doing about thinking explicitly about improving the profession and the understanding of the profession in each of your respective services? Don confirmed to me last night that he knows that, in fact, that's true. So this is going to be a multi-service, cross-service discussion going on, I think, for the next few years, and it comes at a very timely point. So that concludes my remarks, and we're ready to have some discussion with General Martin. So, sir, you're still with us?
Yes.
Okay. You should be able to hear the question.